Okay, so I'm going to introduce our first presenter. Jeff Kane is the fire ecologist, a professor of fire science at Humboldt State University. He's going to be speaking about fuel management strategies to reduce wildfire impacts in California's coast ranges.
Thank you, Hugh. All right, let me find this. I'm going to try to move out here and keep you guys away because I get nervous behind that thing, and I'm short, so I had too well, maybe. So yeah, I just wanted to introduce some, somewhat simple strategies for managing fuels, kind of the state of the knowledge. Some of this will be pretty standard for many of you, but hopefully there'll be some new ideas coming through. And, part of this is there's a clear motivation to kind of being less reactive in our management of fuels and more proactive. I don't think anybody in this room would disagree with that. And I just wanted to reiterate that, we're still in this suppression era of fire management. And so 95%, we've seen these statistics, 95% of fires in California are contained in 10 acres or less. And, while we are getting some benefit from the 1 million acres or more that burn annually, it's still a very strong deficit that's been accumulating over the last 100 years. And we're seeing these increases in the frequency and size of these large fires, and they're often burning under the harshest, most extreme conditions. And this is a major concern, right? There's associated damages and costs to not only communities, but also to taxpayers. And while there is a sea change going on, right? There's a lot of motivation in trying to affect positive change, but we are still have a really big backlog in the amount of area that needs to be treated. It's far less amount of area annually that's treated compared to wildfire. And I would say that we are not quite there yet where we are not coexisting with fire, and that should be our strategy. And so I think it's possible to coexist with fire. This is something that we know Native American tribes, they coexisted with fire all throughout California. So it is possible. Now, we haven't done much benefit to create conditions to make it easy to get back to that. And there's a number of novel challenges to doing so. But I think there's clear paths forward. And an alternative, header to this slide could have been, steps to curb our addiction to fire suppression. But I thought I'd keep it a little bit more positive, coexisting with fire. And the first step is acknowledging that there's a problem, right? The willingness to accept that fire is inevitable, right? That is, we know that's the case. And we need to employ fuel management that's going to be effective to promote positive change where possible. And part of that is not only treating the fuels, but promoting a culture and communities that are truly fire adapted. I know Sarah and Will be speaking to this, and where we're actively engaging communities at all levels to affect this change towards fire adapted communities. And then, where possible, we are going to have to make decisions about trade-offs and trying to limit the potential negative effects of wildfire and promote other things like ecological values and ecosystem services in communities. And in order to do that, we're going to have to work collaboratively to prioritize our values and to implement these treatments and decision-making strategies. And, we heard a lot of good scientific talks, and it's important that we incorporate those ideas, even if they are uncertain, that this is the state of the knowledge, and this is where the point that we have to jump off So it's really essential that we include the science in our fire and fuels management, in our planning and the implementation of these treatments. And then we have, many other scientists have stated this, but it's hard to see a scenario where we can just treat our way out of this situation with things like prescribed burning and thinning treatments, mastication. We are going to have to find a way to rely on wildfires, particularly managed wildfires, under desired conditions to meet our objectives and to treat sufficient area to promote the change we would like to see. And it's important to keep in mind that there's a lot of uncertainty. We will not eliminate risk, right? We must accept some level of risk, and we can do our best to reduce risk and reduce hazard, but we can't eliminate it, right? That's part of being a fire-adapted community and living with or coexisting with fire. And so if you're in the fire science realm, you've seen many a triangle in your day. And I was trying to think of what's the word for somebody that really loves triangles, and I came up with Deltafile, like Delta. So fire people are Deltafiles. And I put this up because, these are the kind of core ingredients that we have to think of when we want to affect change. And so one way to affect change is to is to limit ignitions, human ignitions, especially in communities. This is one approach that we can try to reduce it. Smoky the bear, only you can prevent. Human ignitions is really what it should be. And then, the other part of that is that we can use fire suppression to limit the extent of some of those ignitions, right? And we do that predominantly by managing fuels, by taking away fuels or oxygen or heat, right, to suppress the fire. But largely, whether we're talking about fire behavior or just fire presence, is that we have to deal with the fuels. So whenever you hear the word fuels treatment, it has to treat the fuels, and by treat the fuels, we have to remove fuels, right? That is really essential, or at least alter them sufficiently. That's really the only thing we can do, right? We can't affect topography unless we live in West Virginia, unless you have another idea. And we can affect climate, but it's a really slow, it's been a long arc. I don't think that's going to be a real solution. So when we're treating fuels, we need to look at the fuels and the fuel complexes and think about what the fire behavior we want is in the fire effects in these fuels. And so we talk about things that are going to alter that fuel structure and the amount of fuels. One common term is fuel loading, right? So we want to reduce fuel loading, often specifically in the surface fuels, maybe in the ground fuels, the DUF. We want to reduce fuel bed height, right? These are going to reduce the spread and flame heights of a fire. For the canopy, we would like to increase the ground base height or the canopy base height, right? We want to get those fuels away from that. We've seen some of those that reiterated in adjacent to homes. And then reducing crown bulk density or canopy bulk density. And this is where we're thinning out the crowns of these trees, reducing stand density. And fuel treatments are the intentional alteration of fuels to modify fire behavior and to reduce the potential for negative impacts from wildfire. And the tools we use, we have to take lots of consideration. Clearly, we need to understand the vegetation types and the structures that are on the landscape. What were the characteristic fire regimes of these vegetation types? What are the adaptations that plants have and how they'll respond to treatments and to fire? Clearly, the weather and climate topography, proximity to communities is a major consideration. And then, there's multiple land ownerships across the landscape, and there's many management or resource objectives that need to be included in these decisions of what types of treatments to make and where to put them on the landscape. If we're in the Sierra Nevadas, we have it a little bit easier. It's a much more historically fire frequent area. And we typically, we have these sets of tools, these basic principles that were communicated by Agee and Skinner back in 2005. And they, strongly advocated for reducing surface fuel loading, right? You have to reduce fuel loading. At the minimum, you want to decrease the fuel bed heights and increase the density of the fuels given plot. Increasing the crown or canopy base height, right? Get those crowns off the ground so that you reduce that potential to transition from a surface to a crown fire. And then to limit the spread within a crown, we want to reduce the crown or canopy bulk density, right? And where possible, if there are trees that are large enough, that have thick enough bark that could withstand fire, we want to promote them on the landscape because they can survive surface fires better. Now, these are important strategies for parts of the coastal range, right? So interior forests, oak woodlands, some conifer forests. Where it gets tricky is in other types of vegetation, more coastal vegetation types like chaparral. And so the fundamental principle is that we need to reduce fuel loading in these circumstances. And so how to do that is a little bit more challenging, but there are strategies. And then, we're really good at treating individual stands to promote, desired, fire behavior and effects. And the harder thing is to treat at the broader scale, right? And this is where we're going to affect real change, is at this larger landscape scale. And so, how much of an area do we treat to affect positive change? We want to, given that there's lots of limitations in the amount that we can treat, how much do we need? And some of the modeling scenarios suggest that between 15 and 30%, of the area treated can be, very impactful. And then we want to create heterogeneity across this landscape so that, there's a diversity of fuel structures out there, right? So this can help break up fuels to reduce fire spread in some circumstances. And we'll need to strategically place the treatments on the landscape to maximize their benefit, right? So we saw Dave's many maps, and these maps are essential at helping to prioritize where to treat in the areas. Clearly, we probably want to focus around wildland-urban interface, but we also may want to strategically place them along ridges, whether they're fuel breaks. This can be really helpful in limiting negative impacts. And so there's also, for me, I like fire ecology. I want to represent, the fire regime that's going to benefit the ecological values. And that's essential, right? And there's also the ecosystem services. We saw that nice video on chaparral and the ecosystem services it provides. And that's important and essential to consider. But there are going to be circumstances where we need to balance or trade off some of those criteria with the need to protect things like communities, right? We may not be able to recreate historical conditions. And then we saw, why am I forgetting the first speaker's name? Yeah. Oh, David Ackerley. David Ackerley was talking about how things are going to change, vegetation is going to change. And so historical conditions may not be appropriate to account for that change. And so what tools do we have available to us in our fuel treatment toolbox. And prescribed fire is really kind of undergoing a renaissance, if you will, or a resurgence in use and application. And so prescribed burning is the intentional ignition and application of fire under desired conditions to reduce fuels and to meet these resource objectives that we have. And I'll just reiterate that prescribed fire is very effective at reducing fuel loading, surface fuel loading, right? It's one of the most effective strategies. And it can be very effective at increasing crown base height, right? You're going to get scorched heat, you know, killing some of those lower needles, raising those crowns, and helping reduce the potential for ground fire initiation. It also is going to thin out the stands, killing small trees predominantly. That can reduce crown bulk density to some extent, but usually not that strongly. Now there are challenges, right? There are air quality considerations, smoke production, but we know that in addition to realizing that fire is inevitable, California was, you know, it was, you know, much more smokier historically. And so part of it, living with fire, is living with smoke, right? That said, we need to minimize those impacts of smoke and try to increase, you know, protect sensitive groups, right? One of the other issues is narrow burn windows. This is, you know, we usually implement prescribed burning on the shoulder ends of the fire season. And this is a perennial limitation with prescribed burning. But, you know, you can imagine that as the fire season gets longer, thank you, that, thank you. As the fire season gets longer, there might be changes to this burn window, the opportunities for burning. And one thing is that we also know that there's going to be greater fluctuation in, you know, wetter years are going to be wetter, drier years are going to be drier, and we've seen some of that potential in the last few years. This is going to make it harder, you know, to further narrow some of those burn windows, and that will be a challenge. And then there's also things like insufficient intensity. You know, fires, we're usually burning these on relatively moist conditions, and it may not affect the change quite as much as we would like. Mechanical thinning is another tool that we can use, right? And this is really variable, but can be very effective at increasing crown base heights when we treat the smaller fuels. We can decrease crown bulk density, especially if we treat some of the larger or mid-story trees. And then we reduce stand density. However, it's been stated that thinning alone, depending on what you're doing with those accumulated fuels, it's going to increase fuel loading in many cases. And that is not reducing fuel loading. It's going to increase potential surface fire behavior. And so thus there's often a need for subsequent treatments. And oftentimes there's some lack of social license to treat stands efficiently to affect change. And so we may not get the intended reduction in stand density. Mechanical mastication is also a popular treatment along the coast, in chaparral particularly. And this is good, very good at reducing the fuel bed heights and increasing the density of fuels on the surface, which can mollify, reduce fire spread. But it also increases the amount of dead fuels on the surface, and that can allow for greater residence time, greater amounts of smoldering, smoke production. It can provide greater access to firefighters, but it also can potentially risk escape or, you know, smoldering, creeping fires that cross our boundaries. This, then there's also managed wildfire. And there are some good examples in the Sierras of where this has been effective at treating fuels and has the potential to do some of the heavy lifting, right? This can be really effective at increasing the pace and scale of treatments, effectively reducing fuel loadings, promoting heterogeneity, but there are clear challenges to this approach. One of them is creating an infrastructure decision support trigger points to allow for managed wildfire is one of the things, and that to date has limited some of the application. And you know, the change from wildland fire use to managed wildfire, more adaptive managing wildfires, has kind of muddied the story of the distinction of what is managed wildfire, what is wildfire. And I think it'd be helpful to make sure there's clear definitions so that we can learn from the experiences when they do occur. And then fire suppression is also an important treatment, right? It's not a it's mostly a fire management decision, but it also has implication to the fuels. And in certain circumstances, fire suppression will be required, right? To protect communities, to protect resources, to reduce the potential potential to, you know, basically to reduce the frequency of fire in certain circumstances like chaparral. But it's a good stopgap measure. But we know that this is part of the problem and part of the solution. And so we'll also need to consider the longevity and maintenance of treatments, right? There's no such thing as one treatment. You know, this is something we have to maintain over time. And yet we have persistent challenges here on the coast, one of which is that there are these high-speed wind events that are dry, that are challenging to treat. They will compromise fuel treatments, and they, you know, we need to take strategies, and there's a lot of good talks about how to design, you know, home construction to reduce potential impacts. And I will leave it there.
Thank you. Awesome. We've got a minute or two for questions. Looks like we already have a gentleman. Come on up.
You mentioned the different fuel treatment methods separately, but actually the tea kettle experiment found that the combination of prescribed burning and thinning was the most effective way to maintain the strengths of a forest ecology. Now, what do you, if you'd speak about that?
Absolutely. So sorry if I hid that in my intentions, but yeah, if you're thinning and prescribed burning are the most effective, especially in these historically fire frequent systems. Yeah, absolutely.
So my question sort of builds on that. I've heard criticisms of thinning, that thinning doesn't really accomplish anything in particular. Even if accompanied by the prescribed fire, that the prescribed fire alone might be good.
You know, I think there are clear examples where prescribed burning alone is effective, right? But you can get added benefit from thinning, and that's going through the, you know, changing of the crown structure, essentially.
I think we're going to keep it at that so we can stay on time. Thank you so much. We will have a chance for a full dialogue at the end here. So let's thank Jeff.